A pleasure to meet all at last. Welcome back to films I'm willing to talk about again. Now, it's Friday time. And for that reason, what we're going to do here is we are going to spend a bit of time talking a bit about a film that you might not remember as much. But yet, I owned this on VHS back in the day. It was in fact the American version of a not so remembered Australian classic. It has been about 30 years since they originally copyrighted this movie, and the release of this, of course, took place in 1995. This, of course, is known as Napoleon. And I know what you're thinking, but it's not, like the new Napoleon that we got last year. That, of course, centered upon Napoleon Bonaparte, and it's possible that this was, in fact, how this Napoleon came to be. But in 1995, this was the only Napoleon that I truly got to know about. And of course, I've known that Bonaparte was a similar piece of history, but of course the Bonaparte might have been more well known in contrast to this Napoleon. Anyways though, this movie is centered upon a certain retriever pup whom centers on a certain adventure, a certain quest to find his true destiny. He of course had been referred to by the name Muffin, which likely is what his original name was. However, he preferred to stick to the name Napoleon. Once again, I'm under the impression that that might have been where it ultimately came from. The inspiration of the tale of Napoleon Bonaparte and the French War itself, the Revolution, might have ultimately led to this Napoleon being manifested. Anyways though, a certain pool party ensues, with lots of colorful balloons, happy children, and eventually Napoleon himself getting into the entanglement himself. He's put on a float in the pool and tossed around. You know, it's that crazy stuff that you'd never think would happen to a dog. But it all changes for him when he climbs into a basket, which apparently has balloons attached to it. There's also a tether nearby, and I'm also certain that this once again concludes my original suspicions of how Napoleon was meant to be some sort of object tossed around in this party. But by all seriousness, it thankfully changes, because the tether eventually snaps. Napoleon's mother begs for him to come down and get out of there, but he just can't because the basket keeps going higher and higher, and the balloons just take him far away from home, eventually allowing him to sing his first song. I might as well mention that between the American and Australian versions, there were a few notable changes that came into play, mainly with the casting that came in mind. I, of course, am mostly talking about the likes of Napoleon himself, whom is voiced by the one and only Jamie Croft. And with other characters that would come along later in the film, they of course had their own certain actors. But anyways though, when Napoleon's done singing his own song as he sails through the city of Sydney, Australia, a train catches onto him and he's taken for quite a ride. And when it stops, the basket once again sails away. This time it actually gets out of the city and out towards the ocean, on the way possibly to Tasmania or some other island out in the oceanic region. I might not be that familiar with Oceania, but the entirety of that situation, of course, does revolve around countries and land masses like Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Borneo, Indonesia, and many others that inhabited the southeast outside of Asia. Of course, Napoleon eventually comes across a certain bird that's flying in the sky. This bird is, in fact, known by the name of Birdo. And, of course, like Napoleon, also has a bit of a familiar voice. Philip Quast. And while Jamie Croft and Philip Quast, I might not remember them that much, but they sure do have lots of memories within me as of today. And having more recently watched this movie once again, especially the original Australian version, which is of course where it truly began in '94. There, of course, was the American version, which I had on VHS, and that had similar things going on, different voice actors, but amongst all things out there, I feel like the changes didn't really need to be done, because as long as they have the same language, basically, it helps us understand what they're saying, and more importantly, what they're doing in life. Anyways, though, Birdo and Napoleon get to know each other for a little bit, and they eventually come up with a plan for Birdo to pop the balloons and send the basket careening down towards the earth, where it eventually tumbles down all the way to the bottom of a certain rock formation. Supposedly, Birdo is under the impression that Napoleon was killed on impact. But hey, he actually survived. He jumped out of the basket before it started tumbling down the side of the cliff. So, all's well that ends well on that part. They eventually set off further into the wilderness, where they eventually go through the rainforest, a certain jungle or forest of some sorts. Like I said, I'm not that familiar with most geological pieces and geographical bits of Oceania, so pardon me if I don't end up being that accurate in terms of information here. But in any case though, this is in fact a certain film that was shot on location, mostly out in Australia, mainly in the city of Sydney. But it also does have itself elements of other areas, thankfully within the same generalized region of Oceania as you would have expected, since Napoleon did travel out from the city down to a certain island a few miles away. But in any case though, once Napoleon gets in there, the sky goes dark. He eventually tries to find a place to rest, while also searching for his one destiny, which is, believe it or not, how to become a wild dog. That's because apparently for years, he's been hearing the voices, the distinct howling of a certain wild canid. And he is, in fact, destined, inclined, to try to find it and become one of them. And so, even when he does find himself a suitable spot to spend the night, there's a certain presence that overlooks him and eventually crosses paths with him. This is technically the part where the suspense kicks in, and eventually it culminates to a black cat with those ominous, creepy-ish eyes settling onto Napoleon himself. Unfortunately, while Napoleon does try his best to escape, the cat just gets up to him. And the black cat, while it's technically unnamed, for the record, I mean, it's not the first time that we've had an unnamed character around here. I mean, do you remember the enemy from Nerf's Secrets Revealed Bolts of Intrigue? Yeah, neither do I. But above all serious, well, amongst anything that I might have said so far, this is definitely what you'd call the villain in the film. You have a black cat who believes that Napoleon's a mouse and wants to kill him. I mean, it's pretty goofy for what it is. But being that this was the general nature of cats and mice, it comes as no surprise that this one cat happens to be so obsessed with hunting mice that it mistakes another animal for a mouse. And even though Napoleon tries to plead and explain to her what his intentions are, she just won't listen. This definitely is a villain character whom is a little misjudgmental. And more importantly, has no situational awareness. She doesn't see through her own ego. She doesn't realize that she's chasing a dog who can actually turn a cat into his next breakfast. Literally. If Napoleon wanted to, he could definitely hunt the cat in retaliation for hunting him. But he doesn't, because it's justifiable enough that he's pretty young and Napoleon has no experience with cats and whatnot because he's been cooped up with his mother. But like I said, this is definitely one movie that has some questionable elements put into it, mainly regarding the antagonist itself. But hey, nobody needs to take my word for that stuff. But anyways, Napoleon gets out of there with the help of a nearby owl, whom does guide him and warn him about the cat. She won't stop until he's dead. And when he does get out of there alive, the sun comes up again. He continues his journey through the forest, following those distinct noises that the wild dog is bringing out. Birdo eventually comes back to him, but it doesn't really get much better for him, because there's a point where he falls into the water by accident. Then, thankfully, with Birdo's guidance, he's able to get out of there by swimming. Yeah, this was definitely something that we would have expected to see. For 1995, I'm pretty sure we could cut this film some slack for its age, being that it came out around the same time as other movies starring dogs, like Homeward Bound, Fluke, and who could even forget? The same year, we also got the telltale story of Balto. Yeah, lots of dog movies throughout the 90s. I even remembered Iron Will, which is definitely a movie I'm going to want to talk about, whether later on or some other point in time. But in any case though, when Napoleon does get out of there, the trouble's still not over for him. He still has more obstacles to cross. Once again, going through the forest, where he comes across a frog and more birds. These colored birds that go through the waterfall. These colored birds that insult him, leading him to go back the way he came just to insult them in retaliation. And boy, that's quite a way to go. Imagine if I drove 100 miles only to get insulted by someone, then go back home, and then go back the 100 miles I drove originally just to get them back. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I feel like that this is just a bit of filler that doesn't really need to be implied. If anything, the insults would have actually helped make him feel more brave and courageous against elements that are not so kind to him in real life. It's sort of like how if we were to go into, let's say, a big city, if someone were to make fun of you and not make you feel welcomed whatsoever, it just simply means that it's a good lesson to learn. A way to abide by your own consciousness. A way to reinforce the ideology within you that having goodwill can be helpful for yourself and maybe for the other people. It might even allow them to eventually give you the respect and loyalty that you deserve. You know? Nobody needs to pay back anybody for a certain thing that they do to you. Anyways, though, like I said, a frog and more birds discourage him even further by calling him Muffin once again, followed by another song telling him that he needs to go home. Otherwise, he's going to get roasted and blah, 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 blah. But at least the dude liked the part where Birdo tries to fight the birds, but they just keep coming back. I don't know why, but bird fights just seem to crack me up. I guess any animal fights could crack me up pretty well. But human fights, maybe not so much. Anyways, though, they keep going even further. Napoleon goes through the deserts and mountainous terrains that we all know of as the wondrous, lustrous, not so brilliant nature of Australia's outbacks. Yep, the almighty outbacks are brought together in this movie. Of course, with that in mind, there come more creatures, including a creature that's trying to find water. He digs at the ground, helps find some, and gets further. Birdo comes along with him even more, and he keeps venturing out until he finds a road. Yep, the outback roads in Australia itself. They apparently do, in fact, have a certain animal on the ground. Apparently, a frilled lizard is just lying there. And Napoleon believes that the incoming truck is going to run him over and kill him. He tries his best to get that lizard out of the road, and the truck just rolls right through. Yeah, a Mack Freightliner, hood emblem and all, just rolls through the road right over the lizard. And even afterwards, Napoleon still feels convinced that maybe he's not truly alive after all, hence why he wasn't moving. But boy was he wrong. Oh man. There's just so many things out there that Napoleon has yet to learn about. And therefore, it still just pushes him even further. Knowing that how far he had come along since he started his journey, this is definitely the part where Berto once again tries to convince him to go back home, much like many others have, including that frog. Once again though, Napoleon is just a bit stubborn about this whole thing. He really wants to find these wild dogs, to become one of them. And once he does get going, once again, going through even more terrains and even more crazy obstacles that you wouldn't think a dog could maneuver from, that's basically just part of the whole thing that I loved about this movie the most. They were able to work with helicopters, cameramen of all types, cinematography of all angles, terrains of all formations, yet to have a small dog venture through all of that within the time limit itself. The runtime is of course a bit average, but it does work given the whole budget of the film and all the material it has to work with. Plus the story is a bit self-explanatory. A dog finds his destiny, going far from home, only to discover, believe it or not, once he finally gets to a cave where a certain flood ensues, well, Napoleon does in fact find exactly what he's looking for. The wild dog appears right in front of him at the cave entrance, causing him to faint. And upon waking up, he realizes that these two little dogs that he had rescued from the flood, and that wild dog, is actually their mother. Yeah. Who would have thought that a wild dog had two children in the cave all alone where a flood would just rush on in? And yet Napoleon was able to rescue them. So that at least was quite heartfelt and was certainly a helpful way to bring this movie to a full circle. But yet, it's still not over. Even when Napoleon does find the wild dog and has a bit of a chat with her and her children, he does make friendships with the three. And while this wild dog that he came across truthfully was a sight to behold, Napoleon himself eventually does realize this whole journey he set forth might not have been worth it. It does in fact help him realize that following his destiny should not have been priority one. I mean, he has a mother back home who's worried sick about him. And in addition to this, there's also still the threat of that black cat. And we might as well mention that she does make more appearances, mainly brief cameos. But it's all just to eventually boil down to a certain thing that transpires close to the end. Because Napoleon is sent away on a kangaroo of all things. And this kangaroo, in fact, does have his own song that he sings. And I might as well mention that we do, in fact, have the kangaroo himself being voiced by Barry Humphries. Yep, the famous man himself, good old Barry Humphries, does voice the kangaroo. And with other voices that have come around as well, and other roles that have also shown up, Napoleon does in fact make it to the shoreline in which that he had originally started from. His viewpoint of the city is just right ahead of him. Believe it or not though, penguins show up. Yeah, penguins in the oceanic region. I actually did not ever think about the fact that penguins could apparently live anywhere else other than the Arctic. That's something that I had never once come to think about. I mean, that is still, it's pretty awesome to watch even today. The fact that penguins were in a much warmer area of the world, it does really make you think maybe they aren't as Arctic animals as we might have realized, much like how polar bears aren't the only kinds of bears around. And then again, you have bears that live in warmer areas as well, like the black and grizzly variety. So, like I said though, in terms of how the penguins work in this situation, they, like the wild dog's children back where Napoleon was last seen at, when he gets to the shoreline, and these penguins do also have a bit of a problem of their own that they need some help with. Of course, he does come in to help, and once again, we get to see Birdo. Birdo himself. It's just weird that he keeps coming and going constantly, like making more of a recurring character rather than a side character to accompany Napoleon on his journey. But then again, it seemed that Napoleon didn't really need that much help, knowing that his level of bravery and courage and strength and never give up attitude kind of reminds me of Goku in a way. Except he's not voiced by Sean Schimmel. But as nighttime once again comes around, Napoleon, believe it or not, gets pestered by the cat. Yep, she makes her move one last time, and when she does, oh boy, knowing from what we learned earlier on in the film, she is a force to be reckoned with. And definitely a mouse hunter. So obsessed that she still is on the verge of believing that Napoleon is a mouse when he's really not a mouse. But yet, we do in fact get to see Napoleon win the fight against the cat. Some help from penguins and Birdo himself, as well as the basket that he, believe it or not, came around in. Yep, it was still there, floating around on the waters of the shoreline itself. The cat gets knocked off a cliff by Napoleon. She lands in the basket and just floats away in the ocean. That was epic. Quite a way to climax a fight between a dog and a cat. But once again, Napoleon has to find a way home. The basket was technically his only option. But yet, when there's a will, there's a way. Once again. Because what happens here is that Napoleon is simply set back by a turtle. Yep, he goes back to his own hometown on a turtle. And the penguins and Birdo wish him good luck as well as their own goodbyes. These were friends that he made along his journey. These were faces that he'll certainly never forget. And upon returning home, he reunites with his mother and explains to her what had happened. He found what he was looking for, and he wishes to be called Napoleon. And thankfully, his mother agrees. That is the name of a conqueror, a brave warrior, a fighter, and a survivalist. And that is all what summed up Napoleon himself to a T. So overall, a movie like this that is now 30 years old, approximately speaking, certainly is something to remember. And something that I am, in fact, going to see many times over for years to come. Because they have preserved this film on YouTube with the original Australian version that does have Jamie Croft and many other voices that I have listed. And even having Carol Skinner along for the ride. So, by all means, if you're able to watch this movie, go on ahead. I'll even have a link down in the description below so you can see exactly who has this movie up for preservation. Other than that though, I give this movie a good 8.0 out of 10.1. Once again, not necessarily masterpiece material, but the sheer nostalgia and memories alone preserve this movie so well that I just can't help but give it a higher score than what it might deserve from some critics. And so, this marks the end of a certain work week for me regarding this series. But with lots of other things that I have to offer on this channel, as well as Beetlejuice, it's going to be time for me to head to the theater to eventually have this discussed here on this series. And next week I'll have something similar go down with other movies like Transformers 1 and The Wild Robot taking place. You know that I'm going to have all this stuff culminate to one big year and all the episodes that I've made out of it. And you know what? It sure will be a big, big adventure that'll help make this year quite memorable. So I'll see you guys later with Beetlejuice and another week's worth of stuff.
Whatever I want, I usually get. And I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.